On October 7th, Hamas launched an all-out assault on Israel, initiating a massive rocket barrage targeting Israeli cities all across the country. Shortly after the barrage, infiltration attempts began from the land, air, and sea. What followed those infiltration attempts will live in infamy. Let's analyze what happened and the current position that Israel finds itself in. Forced to respond, Israel will have a tough balancing act, as it seeks revenge for the atrocities committed by Hamas and attempts to prevent a wider involvement of other groups like Hezbollah, Iran, and other regional actors. Starting with the timeline on October 7th. At 6:35 a.m., Hamas launched a massive, indiscriminate rocket barrage, with an estimated 2,200 rockets being fired in the morning of the 7th alone. The leader of Hamas's military arm, Mohammed Deif, released a statement announcing the Hamas operation, citing the conditions in Gaza and the West Bank had worsened. At 7:40 a.m., Hamas fighters were confirmed to have crossed into Israel. The fighters entered into Israel using a series of methods, from trucks and moving on foot to using paragliders to using small boats. These fighters were able to get 40 kilometers inside Israel and in force, enabling them to launch attacks on the Israeli military in the northern border of Gaza. This attack appears to have succeeded, with the Israeli garrison at one base being destroyed and equipment being lost. That equipment includes at least one Merkava tank and an IFE, as well as several vehicles, weapon systems, and communications equipment. Simultaneously, Hamas fighters reached the town of Sderot, where they began mass killings, rapes, and kidnappings of civilians, withdrawing the bodies and kidnapped civilians back into Gaza to be paraded around triumphantly. By 10:30 a.m., Israel had announced that it was at war with Hamas, with the scale of the attack still unfolding. Israeli troops began moving in to reclaim towns in southern Israel, including the town of Sderot, as well as military installations like the one on the border with Gaza. Airstrikes would begin throughout Gaza, targeting Hamas leadership, arms depots, rocket sites, and other critical targets. 100,000 reservists would be called up to active duty as well, setting the stage for a much broader conflict as Israel began to wake up. As the 7th came to a close, it was clear that the course of history for Israel had changed. Over 700 Israelis were killed, with over 2,000 wounded, and dozens kidnapped and held as hostages in Gaza. Per capita, this is comparable to 6 9/11s. Over 400 Palestinians have been killed in the air campaign that followed, with Gaza being one of the most densely populated areas of the world, with 2.3 million people in Gaza and another 9.3 living in Israel. The risk for civilian casualties is incredibly high all across the conflict. Before the sun had set on October 7th, the international community had already begun to speak out, and nowhere was more closely monitored than the Arab world. Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar all condemned Israel for its treatment of Gaza and called for restraint by Israel. Iran, as well as the Taliban, praised Hamas and celebrated the attacks, with the Taliban offering support. The Western world offered condolences and support for Israel, with the US moving a carrier strike group to the eastern Mediterranean. As details about the brutality of the attacks came to light, the UAE would announce that it was appalled by the attacks, marking a departure from its Arab neighbors in tone. Critically, the position of groups like Hezbollah are still yet to be determined. On October 9th, reports of infiltrations, strikes, and fighting on the northern border of Israel along the border of Lebanon began to appear. However, Hezbollah has publicly claimed that they had not launched any kind of attack in support, and that these strikes may be coming from Gazan factions. They have, however, offered solidarity with Hamas, and warned Israel that any incursion into Gaza would be punished. They also warned the United States about using its carrier strike group, implying the future use of its anti-ship missiles supplied to it by Iran. Iran, however, is a completely different story. On October 8th, a Wall Street Journal article showed that Iran had actively trained, equipped, supported, and directed the Hamas attacks over several weeks, with the Iranian Revolutionary Guard giving the final go-ahead on Monday, October 2nd. On October 9th, Israel would call up an additional 300,000 reservists, vastly increasing the scale of its military buildup for war. It also announced that it would be entering into Gaza, with over 100,000 troops prepared for attack. With Israel prepared for the offensive, the war enters into a new critical phase, with Israel now going on the offensive into a densely populated, heavily urbanized environment against an invisible enemy, while Hezbollah has yet to enter the fight and Iran is still lurking in the shadows. A statement by Israel suggested that Iran's plan with these attacks was to to end the normalization talks between Israel and Saudi Arabia, which would deeply threaten Iran. Some negotiations have begun, with Qatar mediating between Israel and Hamas for the release of Hamas prisoners in Israel in exchange for Israeli hostages in Gaza. This war has the potential to escalate into a wider regional conflict, with Hezbollah already having threatened both Israel and the US Navy. Iranian-backed groups in Iraq also threatened US bases across Iraq should the US enter into the fight to assist Israel. With Iran's strong and sophisticated backing of Hamas and the planning of these attacks, Israel will likely set its sights on Iran once Hamas has been handled. Should this happen though, we'll assess the implications of what that would have on the rest of the world. Critically though, this does also impact Azerbaijan, which recently ended the Nagorno-Karabakh war by outright invading Karabakh, ending its independence. Israel has been a large supporter of Azerbaijan, sending material aid to their military. With Israel now fully occupied with a war of its own, Iran claimed that there was no ally left for Baku, strangely overlooking Turkey. Russia has also taken the opportunity to claim that the war will impact aid to Ukraine. However, this is yet to be seen, if it will be seen at all. At the time of recording, Israel is preparing to move into Gaza, with the air campaign setting the battlefield for what is likely to be a long, violent, and extremely dangerous fight. Israel is also engaged in sporadic fighting along the border with Lebanon, where Hezbollah may engage in the fight once Israel begins its incursion into Gaza, but thus far has officially sat the fight out. The fighting along the border with Lebanon could be attributed to either rogue factions of Hezbollah eager to get into the fight, or groups affiliated with Hamas attempting to pin some Israeli forces in the northeast. Israel has some important considerations with their incursion into Gaza. First and foremost would be the reaction of the international community, but mainly the Arab world. Talks with Saudi Arabia for normalization had been progressing, and Saudi Arabia will no doubt be watching closely what Israel does in Gaza, which will dictate whether talks resume and the pace that they advance at once the conflict is over. Another key actor is Iran, which is already invested into this fight but could be preparing for more, though this is entirely speculative. Iran has a number of other concerns beyond just Israel. However, Israel has certainly been their chief concern for decades. Another key actor is Egypt, which on October 9th claimed they had warned Israel in advance of these attacks. However, they have also warned Israel against any incursion into Gaza. I want to end on a note on what we're about to see. Since the end of World War II, Americans and really Westerners have grown accustomed to the idea of limited wars. That is, wars fought in distant areas that only involve a portion of the military, a portion of the economy, but otherwise life goes on. Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan are all examples of limited wars. I say this knowing that they weren't exactly limited for those countries, but for the United States. When Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine, we've been reminded that total wars still happen. For both Ukraine and, to some extent, Russia are fighting a total war against one another. What Israel is entering into is a total war, where all sectors of the economy, population, government, and military is involved. Total wars are considered wars of national survival. Just as Hamas believes that they're fighting for the survival of Palestine, Israel is fighting for the survival of the state. Nothing is sacred in a total war. If it's a valid military target, it doesn't matter if it's a mosque or a school, it will be targeted. This is further complicated when one side isn't uniformed. Rather, it's an invisible insurgency that can easily hide among the civilian population. It's easy for Hamas to use a school as an ammunition dump or a mosque as a command and control node because they're everywhere, and if Israel targets them, Hamas can simply cry foul and show how Israel is targeting civilian infrastructure. That said, in this total war, Israel will target Hamas where Hamas exists. What we're about to see will disturb and trouble us. Israel will not look good once the assault on Gaza begins. Remember, this is one of the most densely populated places on Earth. I say all of this to say that the US has to heed this warning, and I'm not talking about the government, I'm talking about us as Americans. There are other areas in the world that are also doused in gasoline that have yet to be lit, and once they do light, we very well may be involved, and that involvement could become total. I don't mean to sound like a doomer, but this must be something that we account and prepare for, or we might just end up in a similar dilemma to what the US found itself in December 7th, 1941, where its Pacific fleet was largely destroyed, and the US found itself engaged in a total war on two continents against two of the world's most powerful militaries. I want to hear your thoughts on all of this, so comment those thoughts down below and let's continue this discussion. If you found anything interesting, comment that as well down below. Until next time.